Hey everyone! Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Ghost Story Café. My name is Megan, and through this podcast series, I'm hoping to explore some different topics surrounding the supernatural, and I'm also hoping to learn some more about some of these different topics. For today's episode, episode number 3, I'm going to be focusing in on vintage ghost stories. So this idea actually came to me. I was online and I was reading up about some different 1920s and 1930s Hollywood actresses. And I thought to myself that it might be cool to do a ghost story episode focusing on different retro or vintage ghost stories. And I was actually pretty surprised that I came across a couple. So I'll be sharing those with you today. I was able to find 3 really good stories, so those are the ones I'm going to be discussing today. In thinking about what to talk about today, I had kind of written down a couple of thoughts. So the first thing I kind of had in mind was, do you believe that a soul or spirit can linger on in a location after they have died? My kind of big question was, what exactly is it that connects a spirit or a soul, as you might call it, to a certain location? So there's, I think, a lot of different theories around this. Some people say that a tragic event can tie a spirit to staying in a certain location. I guess that's something that's kind of still widely unknown, but it was a thought that I definitely was thinking about a lot while I was going into recording this episode today. So the first story that I'm going to be talking about today is the story of Chicago's flapper ghost of the Roaring 1920s. I was especially excited to talk about this one today because the 1920s is probably one of my favorite eras to research about and to learn more about. I've always been a huge fan of movies and actors and actresses from the 1920s, so I was super excited to discover this story. So for the Chicago flapper ghost, her spirit is tied to the Melody Mill Ballroom in Chicago. Now, the Melody Mill Ballroom was a club that this spirit, when she was living, frequently danced at. Who exactly is the Chicago flapper ghost? So while doing a little bit of research online, I discovered that she's described as having a 1920s style bobbed haircut whenever she is seen, her apparition. She's also described as wearing a short black flapper dress, and she also has very delicate facial features. So anybody that has reportedly seen the Chicago flapper ghost over the years, this is the way that they have described her very often. And that's very consistent as well. So you may wonder, what exactly was it that happened to this woman when she was alive? It is believed that she died on her way home from dancing and probably having a good time at the Melody Mill Ballroom. And it is believed that her cause of death was from a ruptured appendix. I wasn't able to find her identity or her name from when she was living. I am not 100% sure. I think that maybe they're not 100% sure what her name was. It's still something that's unknown. It almost kind of adds a level of mystery to it as well. So next I'll talk a little bit about some of the reports and sightings that were discussed about her, and they're very spooky. So what they've said online is that her spirit, or her soul, was often seen drinking and dancing with men at the Melody Mill Ballroom in Chicago. When these men would offer to give her a ride home, she was happy to get a ride with them. They would offer to drop her off at her home, and when they would ask where she was headed, she would say the cemetery down the road. Now, of course, they thought that this was really unusual, and they were very concerned about dropping her off at this location, especially so late at night, but she insisted that she was staying at the caretaker's, I guess, house, or wherever they were staying in the cemetery. So when they dropped her off, very often she would walk up to the gates of the cemetery, and before their eyes, these various men in various accounts had said that she vanished before their eyes, which I'm sure is not something that they were expecting. So another account, there was one gentleman, he had danced with the Chicago flapper ghost, probably not realizing, of course, at the time that she was a ghost, and he had had such a good time with her the night before that he went back to the cemetery to look for her again. Now, when he arrived, he approached the caretaker of the cemetery, who was out probably looking after the area, and asked him about this woman who claimed that she was staying with him in the cemetery's caretaker house. When the caretaker, heard this, he had absolutely no idea what this man was talking about, because there was no woman who was staying at the cemetery, absolutely nobody, and said that he was the only one who was staying there. So I'm sure that when the man heard this, he was probably pretty alarmed, because he was hopeful that maybe he would be able to meet up with this woman again. But as it turns out, she was very possibly a ghost. So one thing that I thought was also very interesting about this apparition of the flapper ghost was that she was very frequently seen in the 1930s, so during this time which was leading up to World War II. That is when it looks like most of the sightings of this spirit were reported, but I did notice one. This account came from the 1970s. So there was a family apparently visiting the cemetery in Chicago, the one where the flapper ghost was frequently dropped off at. So the family was visiting and said that they saw a mysterious woman in the distance standing beside a gravestone. They had absolutely no idea who she was. They thought it was unusual because this woman, she looked like she could have been from a different time. So her clothing that she was wearing was very different. Her hair, they said it was styled kind of like in a bobbed haircut, so not something typical, like typical fashion of the 1970s era. Now, while they were looking at this woman standing beside the gravestone, they said that before their eyes, she also disappeared. So I'm sure that that was not something that they were expecting to see at the cemetery that day. But it is definitely very spooky to think that they went there for a visit and had potentially seen a spirit of a woman from the 1920s or earlier. So I thought that that was a super interesting story. And if you're someone that enjoys the 1920s and 30s, 40s, and 50s as much as I do, I hope that this is a story that you also enjoy. So my question for you is, do you believe that the flapper ghost is real, or is she simply a legend? I was kind of thinking about this a little bit more and kind of reflecting on her story, and I was kind of thinking to myself that it sounds like her love of life and excitement carried on with her into the afterlife. She was someone that was a really lively spirit in life. She enjoyed going out and dancing and having a good time, and even after she died, it would seem that her spirit was still going out and having fun. I was also thinking, for all we know, maybe she's dancing at the Melanie Mill Ballroom right now. Okay, so the second story that I've included, this comes from a book. I'd mentioned it, I believe, in the very first episode that I did, but it is Ghosts, True Encounters with the World Beyond, Haunted Places, Haunted Houses, and Haunted People. And this compilation of stories was written by Hans Holzer. Now, when I purchased this book, I didn't really have a good idea of who Hans Holzer was, but reading up a little bit more on him, I actually discovered that he is one of the pioneers of kind of paranormal research. So I thought that was neat. Before this point, I hadn't really heard very much about him, but I've been having some opportunities lately to read a little bit more of this book. It is gigantic. It's going to take me forever, I think, to get through this book. But if you ever have a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. So to honor Hans Holzer, the next vintage ghost story that I'm going to be telling is from his book, and it is called Is This You, Jean Harlow? So Hanns Holzer, he would often meet up with people and do interviews with people who were experiencing different paranormal phenomenon in their house. He was always very respectful and always had an open mind to hearing their different experiences. So he had received this call from a couple who was experiencing some different strange activity happening in their Los Angeles home. So as it turns out, this home where the couple had moved into, it was previously the home of Hollywood actress Jean Harlow. So if you know who Jean Harlow is, she starred in many different movies. She was a very talented actress, well known for having her beautiful blonde hair. To give a little bit more of a background on what was happening for this couple, oftentimes they would hear what sounded like a woman walking around the house. The wife had said that on one occasion, her friend was over visiting and they were chatting with each other and heard a woman's voice and also this walking around the house. It startled her friend so much that in the story it said that she had to mix her friend a drink. I thought that was hilarious. So a couple of other things that they said was happening in this home that previously was inhabited by the actress Jean Harlow was that in her daughter's room, they could always smell like this strong smell of perfume. And they said it was really hard for them to figure out what this could be because their daughter was so young at this point in time, she wouldn't have been wearing anything like a strong perfume. Nobody in the house was wearing anything like this. They also said, I thought this kind of gave me the creeps, was that their other child complained about having a hard time sleeping at night because when they would lay in bed at night, they could hear what sounded like a loud party happening inside of their closet. How strange is that? Like, that just doesn't happen on a nightly basis usually, right? So you have to kind of wonder, what's going on at this point. It definitely seems like something out of the ordinary and something paranormal. So I'm sure at this point they were hoping that Hanns Holzer could kind of give them some insight and confirm that some of this stuff was real and help them feel a little bit better about it. So the people who were living in this home, they did kind of have some suspicions that it could be the spirit of Jean Harlow that was lingering within the home. To give a little bit of a background on Jean Harlow, she was very young when she passed away. She was only 26 years old, and her cause of death was kidney failure. So very tragic to hear and to know that she died so young. One of the reasons, one of the ideas that the wife had as to why Jean Harlow could still be lingering around in this home was that she believed the spirit of Jean Harlow was upset, that she was angry because of the way that she was portrayed in different books written about her and how she was portrayed in Hollywood. Oftentimes, Jean Harlow was portrayed as simply being like the blonde bombshell, when in reality, there was a lot of other deeper aspects of her life that they didn't focus on quite as much. So, the wife of the house, who was now living there with her husband and children, she believed that Jean Harlow's spirit was sticking around because she was very upset by this. So when I was reading through the story, I was fascinated by it. I thought, how interesting is that? I don't know what maybe you guys would think about something like this, whether you believe in the, supernatural and spirits existing, but some of the things they were experiencing in their house is definitely hard to explain for sure. So I wanted to kind of end that story with a question. Do you think that Jean Harlow was or is a ghostly roommate to this family living in this house? Now, I'm not 100% sure on when Hanns Holzer had done the interview with this family in the house. I'm going to guess and say that this was sometime in the 80s, the 70s or 80s, but I don't want to confirm 100%. So I will try to find a kind of better timeline for that, and I'll let you know. And just to finish up, this isn't exactly related so much to the supernatural, but I did find this quote. This was said by Clark Gable, and he was talking about Jean Harlow. And I thought that this might be a nice way to wrap up this this ghost story about Jean Harlow. So Clark Gable said, she didn't want to be famous, she just wanted to be happy. And I thought that that was very deep and almost like a haunting quote that he had shared about Jean Harlow. So I wanted to share that with you guys too. So the next story that I'm going to share with you guys, I've never actually heard the story before. This is the first time I've ever read it or heard of it. And I discovered this story on groovyhistory.com. That is a hilarious name for a website. I love it. So this story is actually about 1000 Lombard Street in San Francisco, and it shares a little bit about some of Pat Montandon's experiences with the supernatural. This story took place in the 1960s. So for those of you who aren't 100% sure who Pat Montandon was, she is a social columnist, and at the time she was working mostly in San Francisco. She was living at 1000 Lombard Street when these events took place. She was having a lot of successes in her writing career at the time, so she threw a large party at 1000 Lombard Street. So she kind of did like a funky zodiac theme for this party. She invited all kinds of different spiritualists to come. They did tarot card readings, palm readings, all of that stuff. And she invited a lot of her friends and colleagues to come to this party. Everything was going well until she had, I wouldn't say so much like an argument, but there was some problems that went down with the tarot card reader that she invited to come to this party to do readings for all of the partygoers. She said that she was going to bring this tarot card reader a drink. Now she comes back for a drink with a drink for herself and for her friends, but she forgot to bring a drink for the tarot card reader. When he realized this, he was very upset. Pat Montandon, she apologized and felt really bad about this, but the tarot card reader, he was just so angry and furious with her, and he thought that, he called her rude and disrespectful. So because of this, he cursed her house. He was that angry that he actually said that he put a curse on her house that night. So at first she probably, hadn't thought much of it. It's something a little bit spooky, but maybe you're not going to think too much of it. This was, of course, until some different weird events and things started happening in her house. So apparently, as the story goes, and as I was able to read on this website, her house was always freezing cold. Even though the thermostat was cranked up to 90 degrees, 100 degrees, it just didn't matter. Her house was always freezing cold. And this wasn't just something that she noticed. Anybody that ever came over to her house would comment on how frigidly cold it was inside. She said that she would also hear just these loud screams that would just come out of nowhere, and it would just terrify her and just shake her to her core. Not only this, but Pat also had a couple of dogs living with her at the time, and she said that her dogs would often run into rooms. They would bark at things as if somebody was there, but when she would go to look, there was nobody there. So that was very off-putting and scary for her, and I think at that point she started to realize that this tarot card reader, he wasn't messing around, and he did in fact put a curse on her and her house. So she was so afraid and terrified living in this house just because of all of these different events taking place. She didn't feel safe anymore. She was constantly terrified of being home. So she decided that she would call somebody in to try and do an exorcism of the house. They tried everything that they could, of course, and unfortunately this case was so serious that it didn't work. The exorcism was not effective. And because of this, Pat made the decision finally to move. As she kind of explained, and she's discussed in different interviews about her time living at 1000 Lombard Street, she said that it was all of these kind of paranormal events. It definitely tore her life apart. Like she was just living in hell for so long. And I think she just got to a point where she couldn't take it anymore, and she wasn't sure what to do. So researching again a little bit more about this, I was able to discover that her previous house, 1000 Lombard Street, has since been the site of many different paranormal investigations. So different shows have done episodes about 1000 Lombard Street. They've done like investigations and different kind of supernatural readings and stuff there. It is also reported to be one of the most notoriously haunted locations in San Francisco. So I know that if you look on this groovyhistory.com, you'll be able to read a little bit more details about 1000 Lombard Street if you want to learn more about it. And I also read a little bit more about Pat Montandon's supernatural experiences on Lombard Street from a website that was MissyWinsSFF.com. So I'll make sure that in the link beneath this podcast episode, I'll include all of the links for these different websites and books and things that I discuss. So you'll be able to find them there. Just on a final note to kind of wrap up talking about 1000 Lombard Street in San Francisco and Pat Montandon's nightmare dealing with all of the supernatural stuff after having this tarot card reader put a curse on her. I thought it was really neat. I was kind of thinking about it a little bit more and got to thinking, you know, if you're someone who believes in psychic powers and people like this, possibly this tarot card reader who has supernatural abilities, it's kind of a perfect example of how, you know, these powers or abilities, they can be used for good, they can be used to help people, but like in this case with Pat Montandon in this tarot card reader, it can also be used for evil and it can be used to break somebody's life apart. So it is just so, if you're somebody that believes in this, a powerful thing. So those were the 3 ghost stories, the vintage ghost stories that I wanted to focus on a little bit. Those were the 3 best ones that I could kind of find for you guys to share with you today. I'd like to do a little bit more reading into this, and I'd love to find some more. Those were the top 3 that I found. I really hope that you enjoyed listening to them and learning a bit more about these different stories. Just to kind of jump back a little bit to Hanz Holzer, I shared the story that he had written about Jean Harlow, the spirit of Jean Harlow. And he included something in his book and in the end kind of his story about her that I thought was interesting and kind of tied in with the topic of like vintage ghost stories and kind of reminiscing on times past. So he suggested that maybe these spirits, even the ones possibly that we talked about tonight, are replaying a part of their life. Almost kind of like rewinding a DVD or a VHS or something like that. He compared it to watching a rerun of a show or a movie. So when I got to kind of thinking about that in a little bit more detail, I thought that was cool. Like maybe if you see like a little moment of an apparition, you hear something or experience something, maybe that's like a little snippet or like a little rerun of an event of that person's life. And I could be way off in left field on that. That was just something that Hanz Holzer touched on a little bit in his book. And I thought that was super profound and I never really thought about it in that way before. Not only that, but kind of reflecting back on these stories, the 1920s flapper ghost of Chicago, Jean Harlow, and also the events that happened to Pat Montandon in the 60s in San Francisco at 1000 Lombard Street. I kind of got to thinking, like, what is happening to these spirits now? The spirit of the 1920s flapper ghost, is she still hanging around Chicago in 2021? How about, this was never proven, but the apparent spirit of Jean Harlow, who's lingering at the house in Los Angeles. Has she hopefully since moved on, or is she still lingering around this spot? It's really hard to say. I definitely thought, though, that kind of taking a little bit of a reflective approach to talking about some different ghost stories It's kind of cool to look back and think, especially for somebody like Jean Harlow, to think that these people were possibly living in a home that was haunted by her spirit. I mean, it's not every day, I guess, that you may hear certain ghost stories like that. I know for sure reading up about those different ghost stories was super enjoyable for me. It's definitely been helping me get into the spirit of Halloween a little bit more. While I've been sitting here recording this, I have a pumpkin rum Halloween candle burning beside me. I've kind of been putting up some Halloween decorations slowly over the last couple weeks. I've got like some mini ghost lights I bought at the dollar store and some little pumpkins hanging around. So between the decorating for Halloween and talking about ghost stories with you guys, it's been definitely pumping me up for Halloween coming up next week. And I hope that you guys are getting into the Halloween spirit too. Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. I really hope that you've enjoyed listening to these vintage ghost stories. And I think on that note, I'll end it for today. Thank you guys. Bye.